Welcome back to Southeast Asia Radio. Today, we'll be covering the athletes from the region competing in this year's Paris Olympics and the most recent updates from Myanmar's junta.
We'll also discuss Malaysia and Singapore's social media regulations and Indonesia's controversial mining permit bill. I'm Lauren Mai.
And I'm Japhet Kitson. Today is August 8th, 2024. On this week's conversation,
his view of the anti-corruption campaign is that it's not just economic corruption, but also against political corruption. And by political corruption, he means liberal thinking. And so his anti-corruption campaign targeted not just cronyism, sort of bribery and things like that, but also liberal thought.
Greg and Elina were joined by Alex Vuving to discuss the latest developments in Vietnam. Before that, let's start with our headlines.
For today's episode, we're going to be covering the Olympics, Southeast Asia edition.
How exciting. It's one of the only times I start feeling a little patriotic.
I'm the exact same way. Sports definitely bring out that national pride.
Right. This year, every country in the region sent athletes to the Olympics, with Thailand sending the largest amount at 51 athletes.
Even smaller states like Timor-Leste and Myanmar sent athletes to the Paris Olympics. Out of all of the countries, Myanmar actually had the highest participation record in Olympic history.
No way! Okay, speaking of being patriotic, an Olympic highlight for me were the 5 Filipino boxers competing this year. This year's delegation is the largest boxing team sent to the Olympics, calling attention to the Philippines' push to revitalize its iconic sport.
It's been tough bringing the sport back to its former glory in the post-Manny Pacquiao era.
The icon himself. Unfortunately, Pacquiao's pivot from sports to politics is just so Filipino. But I digress.
Although the Philippines has won 8 medals from boxing, there hasn't been a gold medal quite yet. And with decreasing views and dwindling private sector investments, this year's batch of Filipino boxers are determined more than ever to fight for the gold.
So far, the Philippines has had a historic double win from male gymnast Carlos Yulo, who scored gold in men's artistic gymnastics and the floor exercise event.
Yeah, I actually watched him compete over the weekend. It's the Philippines' 3rd gold medal win, following from weightlifter Heidelin Diaz's gold at the 2020 Tokyo Olympics.
Congrats to Carlos! I'll definitely be glued to my TV to see how the Philippines' boxing team fares in the coming days.
For our next story, we'll be looking at the most recent updates on Myanmar's junta.
It seems like the region has been facing some major leadership shakeups. Myanmar's figurehead president, Min Aung is stepping down from his position due to prolonged health issues.
That's right. The junta's nominal president is suffering from psychomotor issues and malnutrition, and also recently had an eye surgery, which was reported by a state-run news agency.
The junta chief, Min Aung is now taking over all presidential duties.
The junta greatly depends on the nominal president to sign its legal documents and maintain its legitimacy. So what does the president's sick leave mean for the future of Myanmar?
Well, it doesn't bode well for the country's conditions on the ground. Last Wednesday, the junta extended a state of emergency for another 6 months as Myanmar's weakening economy and expanding civil war shakes up its power base.
The junta is promising an election next year as well, but the junta chief may not actually hold an election this time as he has postponed elections before.
Right. Political turmoil in Myanmar has taken a negative toll on the country, affecting tourism and creating a breeding ground for illicit activities.
Myanmar, once famous for its gorgeous Buddhist temples, is now struggling to attract visitors as armed rebellion intensifies.
In 2017, Myanmar received 3.4 million international tourists. But the year after the coup, the number plummeted, with the junta reporting around 200,000 visitors in 2022.
Besides worsening tourism numbers, Myanmar's cyber scam operations have also greatly increased after the junta took power. Lao Cai, a city in the autonomous Koh Kang region, stands out as a major criminal hub.
According to the U.S. Institute of Peace, there are thousands of people from more than 60 countries trafficked into Myanmar for the scamming industry.
Because of the country's worsening conditions, Myanmar took center stage during the ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting in Laos last week.
Indonesia, Laos, and next year's ASEAN chair, Malaysia, discussed the delivery of international aid and encouragement of an inclusive national dialogue.
Additionally, Indonesia, Singapore, Malaysia, and Thailand expressed their frustrations with the junta's unwillingness to participate in peace dialogues.
Hopefully they can get some responses from the junta. We'll need to wait and see how the situation in Myanmar develops in the future.
Next up, we'll be covering a growing trend in the region, regulating social media platforms.
Malaysia and Singapore have recently created regulatory frameworks to increase oversight of social media sites, including Facebook, X, TikTok, and WhatsApp. The regulations come amid concerns of online scams and other malicious activities online.
While Southeast Asia is known for having an incredibly engaged social media population, increased digital services introduce risks of phishing, ransomware, and scams, which often prey upon unassuming users. What regulation has been proposed in Malaysia this time?
To reduce malicious activity, Malaysia will require social media sites to acquire licenses to operate. Set to begin by the end of the year, the regulation requires platforms to renew their license every year, with failure to do so incurring penalties of up to $107,000.
Malaysia has also voiced its frustrations about harmful content to social media platforms. Authorities have referred a whopping 51,638 cases to social media sites this year, issuing directives to the companies to remove the slew of harmful content.
Although Meta and TikTok previously restricted a record number of content and accounts last year, new initiatives demonstrate that Malaysia's rising cybercrime activity doesn't seem to be letting up.
In fact, the government's scrutiny of social media platforms has raised concerns among citizens about freedom of speech as the government seeks to curb provocative content surrounding race, religion, and royalty.
Meanwhile, Malaysia's neighbor, Singapore, is monitoring social media and online marketplaces to detect and report scams and malicious activities.
Much like Malaysia, Singapore's regulations come amid a rise in malicious cyber activity, primarily driven by e-commerce scams. Online scams have lost the country around $486 million.
Singapore's Ministry of Home Affairs has required the verification of users in online marketplaces and the implementation of measures to detect malicious activity.
Regulations in both Malaysia and Singapore demonstrate the government's active efforts in safeguarding the safety of their citizens in the digital space as cyber threats grow increasingly advanced.
But questions remain on the regulation's risk of curbing dissent, so we'll have to stay tuned to see how these regulations are enforced in practice.
It's been a busy week for regulations. Another country in the region just adopted a new law, but it hasn't been receiving much public support.
For our last story, we'll be covering Indonesia's controversial mining permit bill.
In May of this year, Indonesia passed a bill to categorize religious groups as suitable entities for mining operations, raising concerns about these organizations' lack of experience to conduct sustainable mining.
Many religious leaders are happy with this new law. Indonesia's largest Islamic group, Nahdlatul Ulama, pledged its support a week after Jokowi's cabinet adopted the regulation.
A similar announcement was also made by the country's second largest Islamic group, Muhammadiyah, on July 28th. The group's general secretary announced that the group is prepared to accept mining concessions.
While the bill benefits religious groups, environmental activists and other religious groups have criticized the regulation.
Apart from the two biggest Islamic groups, Christian, Hindu, and Buddhist religious organizations have mixed stances on the regulation. While some remain vague about their position, others have explicitly rejected the offer.
Meanwhile, activists worry about the local community's hostile reactions when the mining activities' negative environmental impacts arise. Besides potential environmental damages, critics also believe that the policy is a move from President Jokowi to gather support for his presidential candidate of choice, Defense Minister Prabowo Subianto, from religious groups. The law has definitely caused some internal rifts in Indonesia. Let's continue monitoring this to see if religious groups follow through with their promises to manage the mine sustainably. And those are our headlines. Did we miss anything? Be sure to write us about the topics you're interested in at searadio@csis.org, and we'll be more than happy to cover them. Up next, Greg and Elina's conversation with Alex Vuving. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to another episode of Southeast Asia Radio. I'm Greg Poland with CSIS, joined as ever by Elina Noor with the Carnegie Endowment. Howdy, Elina.
Hey, Greg.
Good to be back after I took a break to sit on the beach while listeners heard Eli Ratner's speech. I don't know what you did. I assume it was also a beach.
Unfortunately not, but I will have my time. So counting down the days. But good for you, Greg.
Thank you. Thank you. I really did deserve it. I appreciate that. On to more serious matters. Today, we have a very special guest, former colleague of Elina's and a longtime friend of mine who was absolutely a key to completing my book on the South China Sea a couple years ago, Alex Vuving. Alex is professor at the Daniel K. Inouye Asia Pacific Center for Strategic Studies, which never gets easier to say no matter how many times I do it, based in Honolulu. And Alex is probably the foremost U.S.-based expert on Vietnam at the moment, at least in my opinion. Alex, feel free to contradict that if you want, but thank you so much for being on.
Speaking of the beach.
Aloha from Hawaii.
The obligatory aloha. And we have Alex on because today we're going to talk about the political earthquake that is taking place in Hanoi. So in case any of our readers have not been paying attention, on July 19th, the General Secretary of the Vietnamese Communist Party, Nguyen Phu Trong, passed away at age 80. I suppose this timing wasn't entirely surprising. Chom was 80 and he's been in ill health for a number of years. But it does mark a real, generational turning point, I think, for Vietnamese politics, particularly amid all the turmoil we've seen of the last couple of years as part of the ongoing anti-corruption campaign, or the Datlo Blazing Furnace campaign, that's seen numerous members of the Politburo fall out of power. As of today, which we're recording on July 31st, things could change. We have newly elevated President To Lam, who's a former public security minister, became the president in May. He has been given at least the interim powers of the general secretary. And I think it's pretty widely expected to be dual-hatted as president and general secretary officially, at least until the 2026 Party Congress. And then we also have Pham Minh Chinh still acting as prime minister. He's the only one of the, quote, four pillars, the senior leaders who were elected at the last National Congress in 2021, who still has his seat. And all of this feels very much like a prologue to the 2026 National Party Congress, at which we'll really see how the political stars realign. So Alex, maybe I can just start off with the very general question. How are you processing Chom's passing? What do you think this means for the state of affairs in the Vietnamese government?
Yeah, I think people have talked about his legacies, the significance of his death to Vietnamese politics. I just want to very concisely summarize this here. I think he has basically two major legacies. In domestic politics, it's the anti-corruption campaign, which is more popularly known as the Blazing Furnace. And in foreign policy, it's his bamboo diplomacy, even though I would say that bamboo diplomacy is, in practice, has been Communist Vietnam's approach to foreign policy since at least the end of the Cold War. So it predates his leadership many years, but he gave it the name. He didn't coin the term because the term was actually borrowed from Thailand. People in Vietnam have discussed whether or not pursuing a foreign policy similar to Thailand's would be better for Vietnam, and they mentioned bamboo diplomacy even in the 1980s. But the mood in the 1980s, 1990 was against that. That would not be good for Vietnam, just oscillate between the different great powers and don't stay loyal to anyone. But now, he sort of approved that officially and gave it a name. And so it becomes sort of a new doctrine for Vietnamese foreign policy. So he has two major legacies in domestic politics and foreign policy. And I think that the new leadership will continue his legacy. So his legacies will outlive him for different reasons. In domestic politics, it's not the anti-corruption campaign has proven to be an excellent tool for whoever has power, in the power struggle within the country. And so it was sort of also enhanced legitimacy to some extent, but basically it's a very useful tool in power struggle. And in foreign policy, bamboo diplomacy it enjoys the consensus among the Vietnamese ruling elite that it's the best approach to uncertainty in international relations. So he has two major legacies. But I think the biggest legacy that he left behind is a party state that has been changed tremendously during his 13 years in power. He became the party chief in 2011 as a compromise candidate. At that time, the party still worked by collective leadership. By collective leadership, you have to find somebody who can sort of negotiate between the different factions and enjoy some sort of a approval from contending factions within the party. And so you have to be sort of a consensus builder. And that is one of the key criterion for whoever is the party chief. And so they chose him in 2011 because he had the potential to be a good consensus builder. And he did. And within a year in power, he launched the anti-corruption campaign, and he was very committed to that anti-corruption campaign. And so he became and that created a sort of bipolar situation within the party. On the one hand, he is the guy who is most committed to the anti-corruption campaign. And on the other hand, then Prime Minister Nguyen Phu Trong was the sort of his opponent, his key opponent within the party. The party became sort of a little bipolar. Now, because of his needs for pursuing a anti-corruption campaign within an environment where actually the Communist Party works by corruption. I mean, bribery is the way to move things forward in Vietnam, which is, actually almost similar to most of the other third world countries, not just to Vietnam. And so increasingly he tried to concentrate powers into his hand. Also, his view of the anti-corruption campaign is that it's not just economic corruption, but also against political corruption. And by political corruption, he means liberal thinking. And so his anti-corruption campaign targeted not just cronyism, sort of bribery and things like that, but also liberal thought. And so it burst a lot of liberal thinkers within the party. So reformers had a very hard time under his rule. So he sort of restrained both economic and political reforms during his time. And also he relied mainly on the police and security apparatus in his anti-corruption campaign. And so at the end, as a result, after 13 years in power, he changed tremendously the system. And so he left behind a party state that now relies mostly on control and corrosive measures rather than on consensus and legitimacy in ruling the country. And that, I think, is the biggest legacy for him. And so I think the significance of his death is that Vietnam is now a different Vietnam, very different. You look at the economic picture, everything else, but I think the nature of how power works within the party, within the regime, is very different now. Previously, it's still, values of consensus and legitimacy. And so whoever would become the party chief would have to be consensus building. But now the system allows for a sort of dictator, somebody who can wield a lot of hard power rather than soft power within the party. If you can use fear and coercion, everything, to force your own comrades within the party to elect you to the party chief, then you probably will be successful rather than consensus builder. So that, I think, is the biggest significance of his death.
Alex, I want to pull on that thread a little more on the domestic politics piece. You've mentioned that Vietnam, like many other countries in the world, operates by inducements, graft.
Yeah.
Is the furnace going to keep blazing under To Lam?
Yeah. Yes.
Will there be more hits to roll? Then can we expect more? I mean,
Yes.
Greg talked about political earthquake. Can we expect
Absolutely.
more tremors?
Absolutely. Because one is that the party itself, despite the anti-corruption campaign, the party has not changed the nature of how it works, which is by what they call corruption, right? Bribery and, personal relationship and so on and so forth. So inducement and all sort of transactional exchange of favors and exchange of everything else at the expense of the public goods and so on. But at the same time, for the people in the power, they can use that, the anti-corruption campaign in their own power game. It's one of the things that Trong left behind was that he relied on the police and security apparatus for his anti-corruption campaign. And so it elevated the police and the security apparatus, or actually the Ministry of Public Security, into a position unprecedented in the Leninist regime. In the Leninist regime, normally the party is, above everything else. So the party has two armed forces, the military and the police and security forces, right? And the police and the military are serving the party. Now, you have a situation where the party gives too much power to the police and the security forces. The police and security forces became the gatekeeper of the anti-corruption campaign, gatekeeper and key executor. When you concentrate too much power into your hand, you can do a lot of things, right? The anti-corruption campaign becomes the key weapons for the police and security forces in their own power game within the party. And so they will continue to use it. for their own benefit, right?
Alex, how confident are you that Tolam will be able to consolidate power in the same way that Nguyen Phu Trong did? Because for me, I hear plenty of concern, plenty of worries about the rise of a police state and the Public Security Bureau becoming preeminent. But in the back of my mind, I keep remembering the 2021 National Party Congress and the fact that even Chom, with all of his power, failed to secure his preferred successor. Chom stayed on because he was forced to, not because he wanted to. And so if the party at that time was so afraid that there was no other man who could hold the factions together, why do we think that now it'll be easy for somebody else to pick up the pieces?
Now, the key difference between Trong and Tolam today is that Trong was the party chief, but not the police chief. Tolam is now both the acting party chief and the real police chief, even though he's no longer the Ministry of Public Security, but his allies, he has put his allies into key positions in the Public Security Ministry and in the party apparatus and almost everywhere. And so he was able to control different apparatuses within the party state. And so he can concentrate right now, but, institutionally, as he's still not a general secretary of the party. He's performing the duty of not even the acting. I'm not sure. Maybe they can elevate him into an acting general secretary at the next plenum of the Central Committee. But still, at least he is performing the duty of the general secretary. And so he has the right to nominate people. He has the right to recommend people, to move people to different positions within party state. So now he can concentrate he is both party chief and police chief. So you can imagine that his powers now far exceed the power of Nguyen Phu Trong in 2021.
So I'm hearing some concern about how much more of a grip Tolam at least will now have over the whole country, given his consolidated powers, even in his acting general secretary capacity. I guess on the bamboo diplomacy side, if these concerns about authoritarianism as defined by European countries in particular, but also in the United States, again, depending on who wins the election in a few months, is that bamboo diplomacy going to be feasible or tenable?
So there's no translation from a more authoritarian Vietnam into a Vietnam which is leaning more toward China or Russia. That's not the case. So power within the country, whoever is in the power wants to concentrate power within the country, but at the same time, Vietnam is a small country and it has a lot of disputes with China. And territory disputes with China, nobody can ignore. No ruler in Vietnam can ignore. Even though the ruler in Vietnam can rule a country with a lot of coercion, but at the same time, you can see with many of the authoritarian leaders, they also see in nationalism a good tool for them in the power politics in there. So I think whoever is the leader in Vietnam will also see nationalism and the conflict with China in the South China Sea something that they need to use in their own benefits rather than to commit suicide by befriending with China and selling out Vietnam's interest in the South China. So bamboo diplomacy has been seen as the best way to deal with uncertainty in international relations. And that is the consensus among all the Vietnamese leaders, and irrespective of whether the leader is more liberal or more authoritarian. Now, on the other hand, the capability of the West, the United States or the European Union, influencing Vietnam is small, not big. Europe is far away and is still not very capable in dealing with Russia. The United States is also far away, and we may also have a very authoritarian government even. Only China has some sort of big, significant influence on Vietnam. But even so, Vietnam is not a very small country for China to manipulate. And also in Vietnam, you have to think about the strength of nationalism. It's very easy for the Vietnamese to sort of call boycotting Chinese goods. Very easy. You need to restrain nationalism. Whoever is the ruler in Vietnam has to restrain anti-China nationalism in Vietnam in order to be able to talk to China and to keep diplomacy at some sort of workable level. Even if Vietnam has a Xi Jinping, the Vietnamese Xi Jinping will still follow the bamboo diplomacy, try to reach out to all the great powers and try to get benefits from the relationship with all the great powers, particularly the United States and China, but also Japan, India, Russia, the EU, Australia, ASEAN, South Korea, everybody. That's now sort of the Vietnamese doctrine. Although personally, I don't think that is a very good way to deal with international relations in our current era, because it's not just about you're dealing with the great powers, not just about you're dealing with uncertainty, but you also have to deal with the long-term tendency of great power competition, particularly between the United States and China. And for Vietnam, you have the conflict with China in the South China Sea. You share a border with China. You also feel the increased Chinese influence in Laos and Cambodia at your expense. And so I think bamboo diplomacy is not the best response to the great power competition. However, people have their belief. And in Vietnam, the belief is that bamboo diplomacy is the best way to deal with international relations. And so they are going to pursue it until they are forced to change their foreign policy.
Just to clarify a point, as you said, the term bamboo diplomacy is borrowed from the Thai context. And in neither the Thai nor the Vietnamese context does bamboo diplomacy mean neutrality. That's not what it means, right? It means that the bamboo bends with the wind being national interests. So Thailand sided with the Brits and then sided with the Americans when it was useful. Vietnam sided with the Soviets during the Sino-Soviet split and is now leaning toward the U.S. because that's viewed as the best way to protect Vietnam's own national interests, which are mainly opposed to Chinese hegemony. It can be quite frustrating for Americans who are used to seeing the world in black and white. That does not mean that middle powers or small powers who bend to their own national interests are choosing neutrality. They're choosing whatever is best for them. And at least at the moment, that can work in the U.S.'s benefit when it comes to at least security and economic relations with Vietnam. Let me close with the one issue we haven't really touched, which is economics. To Lam or whoever ends up elevated in 2026 is stepping into what I view as a pretty difficult time for Vietnam. You know, it's been the darling of foreign investment in Southeast Asia for a decade. It's been clearly the biggest beneficiary after maybe India of companies' efforts to diversify their supply chains out of China. But over the last year, maybe 2 years, we get growing signs of concern, caution from some foreign investors, mainly related to infrastructure gaps, infrastructure shortfalls, regulatory approval issues, right? Red tape because of the anti-corruption campaign. Not to say that corruption is not a real problem and not to say that you shouldn't fight corruption, but the perception that the anti-corruption campaign has been so selective and unpredictable that now officials are afraid of their own shadows. So nobody will approve anything. If the party's legitimacy is at least partially based on economic success, then how do you fix that problem? How do you ensure that the effort to reimpose party discipline and crack down on corruption doesn't kill the goose that laid the golden egg, which is foreign investment?
Yeah, that's a great question. So great question. I totally agree with your observation. Even though for now, Chong's legacies continue to be adopted by the new leadership, you know, they are going to continue the anti-corruption campaign also selectively, as you said, and to their own direction, to their own benefit. And that has negative implications for the economic situation. And so I think sooner or later, the Vietnamese leadership will have to change their policies, both domestically and foreign policy wise. But domestically, you have to somehow find a way to boost economic performance, to make the bureaucracy a little more effective. Also, foreign policy wise, you also have to change your approach. So we don't know which direction they will adopt. It all depends on the circumstances at the time when they are forced to change and who would be at the helm at that time. We don't know. There are a lot of uncertainty about the new directions that Vietnam will follow in the next several years. But I think Vietnam will have to change their policies. They will have to change their policy. That's a big question for them. Taking everything into consideration, I think that there's a big chance for Vietnam to change their policy to the more sort of liberal direction, both in economic policy as well as foreign policy.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there, Alex. Thank you so much for joining us today. Elina, thanks for coming back. So Elina and I will be back in 2 weeks for the next episode of Southeast Asia Radio.
Thanks.
Thanks again for joining us for this episode of Southeast Asia Radio. Feel free to write us with any comments, questions, or feedback at searadio@csis.org. We'll get back to you.
Do us a favor and subscribe and give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or whatever streaming platform that you listen to us on. Tell your friends about us.
Marla Hiller is our producer, and our interns are Zhang Pham and Emily De Leon. Our co-hosts today were Greg Poling and Elina Noor. My name is Japhet Kitson.
And I'm Lauren Mai.
And we'll see you in 2 weeks for another episode of Southeast Asia Radio.